Did they even change anything in the PvP zone that I know about that I can do a test dummy? Because what I was trying to get at earlier, right? If you mouse over, it says Hungering Arrow can only pierce up to 4 times. So is that the person answering the question or they're not answering the question? Because the legendary passive answers the question. And then when I told them to, when I told the other person, and then another person says that I didn't give it anything, where I told them, okay, open your equipment inventory screen, click details, mouse over to area damage. It will give you a in-game tooltip that writes what area damage does and what you need to do with it if the build plays with area damage, right? So it's not really any answer. The answer is given by by the legendary item, the legendary passive when you mouse over it, or the tooltip. In terms of answering a person's question, you have to consider an in-game play. Now, the in-game play, like I said, is just like a test dummy area, which I was showing earlier in the Challenge Rift. At the start of it, even before the Challenge Rift started, because if you're talking about the Challenge Rift, you're talking about the actual challenge itself. The zone before you start a Challenge Rift has a test dummy. Now, you even have to test, and then it should tell you, okay, it should tell you, let's say you're doing this on there in the test dummy area, and then imagine if you're when you're doing a GR, right, you're strafing everywhere. It should tell you that, oh, so up to 4 times, which means like, okay, let's see, show numbers, gameplay, what show numbers can do, right? Okay, monster health, okay, healing numbers, damage numbers. Does it tell me? Well, I guess when you stun them, it does say the stun, but it still doesn't say like this monster has been pierced exactly 3 times when you are exactly um what you call it, when you're strafing in a certain direction and position to the yards, to where you're maximizing both area and your pierce. So when giving an answer, you're not really just going to be standing there thinking about it like that. So mechanics is not just giving the answer of like, oh, Hungering Arrow is guaranteed to pierce and also deals X% increased damage. Hungering Arrow can only pierce up to 4 times. So this is only telling me that the in-game legendary passive wording, quote unquote, sucks, right? What does that what does this legendary passive mean? What does it mean? Even better, in fact, the tooltip here, if it doesn't help anyone, the tooltip, the in-game tooltips. So you know how in any game you have the help section, right? Like, I don't know, I guess I my hotkey H is not there. But I think in Diablo 2 you have the help hotkey and stuff like that. Imagine this: the area damage, the tooltip here. All attacks have a 20% chance to also deal 128 well, whatever, 128, it depends on your area damage and whether your build does it, of the damage to enemies within 10 yards. So another question somebody will have is, well, how can I assume 10 yards in a fight? Like when you're really, really busy and you're strafing all over the place because this is the build. Okay. Do you want to have a ruler on your monitor, perhaps, so that you ideally answer the question? Or like how there's the really, really clear image where the original poster posted the exact radius, like that radius image, like, okay, so 10 yards is probably the waypoint or something, right? Or like it's the smaller waypoint or the whole platform thing, whatever. So unless during the GR you can actually mimic it, or like your practice of strafing is exactly the 10 yards, you're gonna and then you also have to remember when answering somebody, okay, yes, an answer is static, but when you're answering for the build mechanics, you have to consider yourself doing a certain action. So unless I know that this, okay, so for example, Kadala or a flag or the flag is a monster. So when I do this, it might as well say you hit them at 8 yards, for example. So my area damage will trigger that 20% chance. It should say, oh, area percent triggered, area damage percent triggered, um, 8 yards. And then if I'm doing this, and then let's say the flag is monster one and Kadala is monster two, then when I do this and the hungering arrow hits, for example, monster one and monster two, that that monster there, that hungering arrow that flew to her, um, that one actually hit her through one pierce, meaning to say that it should say through one pierce, and then when I'm away from this monster, it should say, oh, only the direct shot, right? By the time you do that in an actual GR, on top of elite affixes and everything, it's not the actual gameplay mechanics of the build. You're only mentioning what the legendary passive is saying. It doesn't answer the person's question. The legendary passive answers the question. You can clarify, but it says 4 times. It's not like you can't even clarify. The clarification is monster 1 and monster 2, unless you can mark it, like for example in WoW, where you flag, where you mark the different shapes. You know, oh, this raid boss on the left is positioned for people who need to play in the moon star marker, or whatever. The skull person is the leader, and so on. The leader's position and the leader group and so on, right? So it's not like you can mark, aside from mark for death, I guess, right? You can do mark for death. You can do mark for death, and then you can assume that using the mark for death as monster one, monster two, because it does say spread closest to 3 enemies. So you have to have 3 enemies to do something that takes advantage of this rune. So yes, unless they have something for that denoting the number of peers on that exact monster, then it answers the question visually. Otherwise, it's just whether so and so reads the legend passive of anything, any item. It doesn't have to be pierced 4 times. It doesn't have to be anything. It can even say your hatred generators reduce your damage taken by 47 for 5 seconds. Now we're hitting. Now this is also another thing. Let's say the question is that is for this wraps of clarity. Your hatred generators reduce your damage taken by 47% for 5 seconds. Now, sure, the 5 seconds is like right here, the active bar. But are you going to keep your mouse? I mean, you can visually look at it, but you have COE to look at. You have other buffs you're looking at. Okay, it are you going to tell me like, oh, I want exactly 5 seconds only, so I have to assume that when this is gone, it's more effective for me to hit only when it's the 5 second, well, before, right before 5 seconds is up, which means 4.8 seconds. I should hit it like that, like right before it goes down. I should press it. That is the answer, though. That's the that's the answer you're giving. If somebody asks you what reps of clarity does, right? That's the answer you're giving. You're giving the answer that right before 5 seconds, hit it again. That's when damage taken is reduced. But if you're playing mechanically in game, if your build makes you press all the time, it's not 5 seconds. It's not really for 5 seconds. It's always going to be at 5. See, it's always at 5 because that's every press based on the build. So unless you're not doing something, which means you failed it. So let's say my answer in my wall of text, okay? If you died and you're using COE, and when you die, you don't deal any damage, that's also going to affect the mechanic of how much damage you're doing during a pierce mathematically, because you have to calculate all the percentages, right? Whether it's monster 1, monster 2, if you died right. Okay, so if you think about a ruler and or a grid, right? A grid. If let's say I died at this spot on a COE cold cycle for the build, then imagine this. Imagine it says you just died at 9 yards to the first monster, where you can also pierce up to 2 or 3 monsters in the direction of Kadala being the second monster. So you're actually losing damage based on the mechanics. But if you're just gonna say at anywhere you're missing damage, well, of course, if you die, you miss damage. But that doesn't say anything of mechanically speaking for the build. So the answer is not so clear cut. And if it is clear cut, the clear cut answer comes from the legendary passive. Because when you die, you waste a lot of the damage based on whenever whichever elemental damage is your cycle for. So like I'm cold, which means if I did use COE and if I die, I lose more mechanics of damage because I cannot justify just doing this like that all the time. Like in the same position, in the same yards during like craziness, right? It's not just in town, whether the town has a as a test area. I think there might be one, right? I haven't been to this side in a long time. Where is it? Well, I guess you can go down here to test, but that's still not build specific. Is it down here?